Okay, I think we can get started. Apologize for that.
No problem. We're gonna wait about maybe 5 more minutes. We're just waiting on a couple more people to join. So that's good. The timing is great. So we'll get started in about 2 minutes.
All right. Who's going first between Cheyenne and I?
Cheyenne.
Oh, okay, cool. I predicted it like that. Yeah, because I was like not trying to focus too much on like the sex slavery element because I know Sister Cheyenne is gonna do us a solid there. I think are we not live? Looks like we're live.
We are.
Oh, already?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Yeah. Hi, everyone who's watching.
We've been talking about my nephew.
It's late too.
Oh, hi, Victoria. Okay, so greetings and welcome. We can get started. We're about a few minutes over. We do apologize for that. But we want to make sure that we are respecting everyone's time, as well as also recognizing that we unfortunately have a really hard stop at 3 o'clock, and that's because we have another program, and I was reminded of that via WhatsApp, so I am on top of that. So my name is Sister Njiba, and I'm a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, and I'm officially welcoming you to our webinar titled Dealing with the Silence of Sexual Violence and Human Trafficking, a Pan-Africanist Approach. I'm excited about this conversation, as is the AAPRP and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, because it's time for us as Pan-Africanists to have a real critical conversation about sexual violence and human trafficking. So we have two amazing speakers who I will introduce a little later, but you may have seen them on the flyer. Our first speaker is Cheyenne Jones. She's an activist around domestic human trafficking with emphasis on local sex trafficking. So I'll tell you a little bit about her a tad bit later. And our second speaker is Comrade Zukizwa White, whose name I kind of almost got right, but I don't think I got right. She's a Pan-Africanist. She's a Pan-Africanist and a member of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, a public relations expert and activist working with rural women on human rights issues. So why are we here? Sexual violence and human trafficking are silently oppressing African women in the diaspora and on the continent. These silent killers are in reality open secrets that link to the human exploitation of capitalism and the oppressive structures of patriarchy. We as African people need to directly confront the social structures that underpin sexual violence and human trafficking and challenge the individuals and groups perpetrating these heinous activities. We must challenge the so-called culture that promotes women as sexual objects and denies their contributions to the development of Africa. So this is going to be a roundtable discussion. Before we get into it, I want to give you sort of the rules of engagement. We're going to do a quick introduction to the AAPRP and the PAC, and then we're going to have two 15-minute conversations or discussions, and then we'll do some discussion, open open question and answers. And then at that point, we'll allow the audience to chime in, make their discussion points, and make their recommendations. As I mentioned, we do have a hard stop at 2:55, so I'll be managing the moderation a little bit on the dictatorial perspective, but I apologize in advance for that. We will be having a part 2, and so we will be able to carry this conversation to the next level in the next couple of weeks. So let me tell you a little bit about the organization sponsoring this. The All African People's Revolutionary Party, AAPRP, is a permanent, independent, socialist, revolutionary, Pan-African political party based in Africa, the just homeland of African people all over the world. The APRP understands that all people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or in any other part of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation. Kwame Nkrumah said this in Class Struggle in Africa. The APRP is an integral part of the Pan-African and World Socialist Revolutions, and we're guided by an Nkrumah's ideology. We're striving to become a mass party, capable of politically educating and organizing the masses around, the oppressed masses around African living conditions, suffering, and struggle in over 113 countries. We believe that Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. The APRP is a product of relentless struggle within the Pan-African movement for ideological clarity, scientific and precise, objective, and revolutionary mass Pan-African political organization. It represents a quantitative and qualitative development in our long history of struggle against gender, class, economic, and national exploitation in all its various forms. So the APRP, we also have a women's wing, and that's called the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. The APRP understands that the liberation of African people cannot come to reality without the effective and genuine liberation of African women. The APRP also understands that African women cannot fight a liberation struggle separate from the broader liberation struggles of African people. They go hand in hand. The manifestation of this underpinning occurred in 1980 when the AAWRU was founded in Ohio. The AAWRU was responsible for ensuring that all vestiges of sexism are rooted out of our party and the larger society, that women and men are educated about the revolutionary role of African women in the revolution, and to ensure that the voice, interests, and energies of African women are completely integrated into every aspect of our work to build the APRP and a free Africa. So we would like to, on behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and All African Women's Revolutionary Union, welcome you to this first webinar. I'm now going to turn it over to Sister Zukiswa White, who's going to tell us very briefly about the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Please, sis, you're welcome.
Was muted. Izole to beautiful Africans. The Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania is a liberation movement born out of apartheid South Africa in 1959, which now operates as a political party in the so-called democratic dispensation of this land of ours known as South Africa. The PACA was founded on 3 pillars: African nationalism, continental unity, and socialism. Right, so very similar to the aims of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. In Pan-Africanist circles, we emphasize that the PACA of Azania is, the revolutionary vanguard holding the line of march for African liberation here in occupied Azania and, of course, on the continent. With how the PAC came about was, as some people might know, as a result of a breakaway by the Africanists from the African National Congress, who is the ruling party in South Africa today, after it was established that, the liberalism that the party was moving into at the time was no longer in line with the Pan-Africanist revolutionary objective of land return to the indigenous people and freedom and liberation for all of Africa and her people in and her people. So yeah, in 2020, we exist, as I said, as a political party, and really ours is to continue with the important work of being engaged in people's struggles on the ground, not necessarily a race to the ballot box. Our members, are bounded by an oath of allegiance to really commit ourselves to the African people's struggles and to form the necessary solidarities in occupied Tanzania, in Africa and globally to advance the African people's struggle here and elsewhere. Isolate. You can follow the PAC also, sorry, we're on Facebook, of course, at my PAC online or Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania, on Twitter, my PAC online, and of course, find out more about the PAC on the website www.pacoftanzania.org.za. Africa.
Thank you so much, sister. So I'm going to also want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. And then that way we can just flow through the process. So briefly, I'll talk a little bit about, very briefly, like for 2 minutes, about sexual violence and human trafficking, what it is, and its connection to patriarchy and to capitalism. And then we're going to go straight to Sister Cheyenne, who's going to talk about sexual violence and local sex trafficking, Nova Scotian perspective. And then we're going to go to human trafficking in Southern Africa by Comrade Zukizwa. And then we'll do discussions and some strategies, because we also want to come out away with having some strategies about how can we move the process forward. So first, we all know what sexual violence is, but I think it's important for us just to be clear about what we're talking about on this webinar. Sexual violence means someone is forced or manipulated into unwanted sexual activity without their consent. And in many cases, sexual violence can be rape or sexual assault, child sex abuse or incest, intimate partner sexual assault, intimate partner violence, unwanted sexual conduct or touching, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, showing one's genitalia, and many other forms. Sexual violence can happen between men and women, women and women, men and men. And so sexual violence is not just dedicated to one gender, right? And so we also have to recognize that sexual violence happens across the board. And we're talking, we won't be talking about all aspects of sexual violence today, but we certainly will be talking about, we recognize that sexual violence is not just a one definition. And then when we look at human trafficking is really, as it's called, it's a trade in human beings. So it's a trade in forced labor, it's sex slavery, it's commercial sex exploitation. In the African context, in some cases, it's the trade of domestic workers. It's the trade of workers across borders. It's the trade of women from spaces like Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana to go to India or other spaces under the guise of being house help or under the guise of having a singing career, and they find themselves in the middle of sex rings. So human trafficking is multifaceted. But one of the most important things that we want to hone in on around human trafficking and sexual violence is its connection to capitalism and patriarchy. So of course we know capitalism is an economic system, right? And we know that this economic system puts private property over humanity. We know that the economic system is rooted in rampant individualism and exploitation. We know that this capitalist system does not care about men or women or children. And so this capitalist system, which often finds African people at the bottom of the class ladder, is very much intertwined in this conversation of human trafficking and sexual violence. The concept of, and I'm doing this quickly because we are already behind, the concept of patriarchy, the section where men find themselves in leadership positions, they use their patriarchal power or their power connected to the white hegemonic power structure in order to direct the lives of women and to put together laws and rules about what women can do, what they can't do, and their existence in society. Ultimately, the social construction of gender, where women find themselves primarily focused in the reproductive sectors of society. This all this all contributes to sexual violence and human trafficking. So we're going to hear today, and I'm sorry that I had to breeze through this, but we're a tad bit behind, and I wanted to make sure that I give our speakers enough time. We are going to breeze through these discussions and hopefully be able to tease out in the breakout discussion a little bit more about how patriarchy and capitalism impacts sexual violence. So who is our first speaker? Our first speaker is Cheyenne. She's a survivor of childhood rape, trauma, and prostitution, and shares her story as a means to inspire action that lead to meaningful change. As a local anti-human sex trafficking advocate and abolitionist, she offers peer support and advocacy for female and LGBTQ survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking. Cheyenne has worked on special projects for the local police force's human trafficking unit and offers anti-trafficking consulting services and awareness presentations in the broader community. Cheyenne recently joined the AAPRP. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Cheyenne. She's speaking about sexual violence and local human sex trafficking, a Nova Scotian perspective. And I hope you can agree with me that it is very important to hear from both advocates of sexual violence and also individuals who have experienced sexual violence. So they can both tell us about their experiences as well as show us how we can advocate for those of us who have not had this type of exploitation and oppression emitted upon us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sister Cheyenne. She has about 15 minutes, and we are going to get into a very exciting discussion. Sister Cheyenne, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Mjiba. I am, and greetings from Nova Scotia, Canada, everybody. I am very honored to be a part of this panelist discussion with Zukiswa and Mjiba, so thank you so much for having me. The first thing that I wanted to say is for all of the people who are watching, I just wanted to welcome you and say thank you for wanting to be a part of this very important discussion, because it takes courage to allow yourself to hear the things that are being discussed, and it takes courage to be a part of it. So first and foremost, thank you for that. Now, when it comes to Canada, sometimes internationally, Canada's reputation is one of, the big friendly nation, big friendly giant. And when it comes to sexualized violence and human trafficking, I just want to say that Canada is no different than any other country on the face of the earth. When it, actually, according to Canada's Women's Foundation, they reported half of all women from the age of 16 in Canada will experience sexual violence, sexual abuse, or physical abuse at least once in their lifetime. So human trafficking is happening here, and it is happening on a large scale as well. What we're seeing is domestic sex trafficking. So what that means is that the crime in its entirety is happening within the country. Now that can be students, it can be permanent residents, it can be visitors, temporary workers, whomever, but as long as all of the elements occur within Canada, it's considered to be domestic sex trafficking, and that's what we're seeing. Where I live, which is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia is the second smallest province within Canada. Halifax is its capital, and here, Statistics Canada has reported that we have one of the highest rates of police reported incidents in our entire nation. So it's happening here on a very large scale. And we're considering, well, it's considered to be a recruitment hub. So this is where the girls and the children and victims are groomed, and they are recruited here, but then they're taken outside of the province, first to our most neighboring province, which is New Brunswick, to get their initiation in strip clubs. And then from there, they're moved along the network to bigger cities like Montreal and Ontario, and where they are forced to have sex for profit. And another thing that we're seeing here is that the average age of recruitment in Halifax, and actually right across Canada, is between 12 and 13 years of age. Although I will share with you, just a couple of days ago, I learned of a trafficked girl who was with a John, and he brought in a very frightened 10-year-old girl to join them. One thing about this area is that exploitation here in Canada looks a lot like domestic violence. versus the stereotypical kidnapping internationally. And what I mean by that is, and I think that's because the most common form of recruitment here is like the Romeo pimp or boyfriend technique, where traffickers will pretend that they care about their victims. They will pose as boyfriends, they'll pose as father figures, protectors, some will pose as friends. And so the vast majority of trafficking victims in Canada are trafficked by someone that's close to them. They'll buy them gifts, pay them attention. In a lot of cases, these victims, these girls, these children have not had this type of relationship with anybody else. So they become very, very close to their trafficker. And in many cases, which is a very big barrier for us, but in many cases, the people that are being trafficked don't realize they're being trafficked, and they're not able to distinguish that they're being trafficked from an abusive relationship. There's no distinction there. Even sometimes when after that relationship ends, where the trafficker will discard the survivor because she is no longer valuable to him, there can be months or even sometimes years later, well, that survivor still will consider that person their boyfriend, even after that relationship is end. So that poses a barrier for us who are trying to provide, post-care support for survivors, and also provides barriers for us trying to advocate for survivors. One thing I really want to talk about here within the African community, within the Black Nova Scotian community, which is something that I think is very unique to Canada. You're not going to find this anywhere else in our country. Is, well, first and foremost, there's a vast amount of Nova Scotian girls being taken out of the province, as I said, with the statistics. But what's happening with the African girls is that they have, for the most part, bought in to the lie that their value and their worth is dependent upon helping their trafficker with his capitalistic conquests. They have bought into the fact that they'll take some pride even in saying, I've helped this person acquire these things. That's what they think that that's where they get their value, and that's where they get their worth, which is so unfortunate. And it's been normalized so much within the community that it's very hard to break out of. And in some cases, they don't think that they're doing anything wrong. Their aunties did it, their mothers did it, cousins did it, and this is what they're doing. It's very difficult. And it's also very difficult because these girls are not accessing services. The Black community are not going into the safe houses. They're not going in to get post-care support. They're not going in to get counseling. And in my work here in Nova Scotia, I have only personally come across 2 African women that have come into the service to acquire services. And when I contact my colleagues in Ontario, where 2/3 of human trafficking takes place in this country, all the 3 advocates that I've contacted have not had any association with the Nova Scotian girls. One of which, she says that half of her class they say that are African women, but none of them are from Nova Scotia. All of them are from Ontario. And that goes right across the board. And that's really concerning to me. And I think that that's something we definitely need to look at, is where are our girls? Why are they not accessing services? And how can we get them to see that this, in fact, is an issue? This is a problem. This is not normal. It's not okay to be somebody's slave. It's not okay I guess what really comes down to is you have to show them the difference between healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. Another thing that I just really want to talk about before my time is over is when it comes to human trafficking, there's no choice. Even sometimes with the police department, they'll get confused and they'll think that with human trafficking, these girls are choosing to be a part of it. These girls and children, because it's majority of this is happening to children. For 72% of the victims here in Canada are under the age of 25. under the age of 25. And I'm quite certain if we asked those people when they started, they would say about 12, 13, 14 years of age. But it's very important that we understand that there's no choice in this, that these youth are being manipulated into this, and they have no choice in the matter at all. One thing that's starting to happen here is that our police departments are starting to talk about human trafficking, even though Nova Scotia has highly sophisticated human trafficking networks that have been operating for decades and decades. And it is not new to our local police enforcements or our federal police enforcements. This is not a new thing, but the conversation is starting to happen now because of things like the Me Too movement, and even the Surviving R. Kelly series, and these things have put it out there on the forefront a little bit. So people are starting to talk about it. But from what I'm seeing here in Nova Scotia, talk is pretty cheap, and we need to start doing some things to actually end the demand. So I don't know. I'm very interested to hear about Zukiswa, because here in Nova Scotia, we're not seeing that. In Canada, we're not seeing anything that goes toward ending the demand. One thing about Canada is very good at putting policies on paper. They're very good at that, right across the board with a lot of different things. They will be able to refer to certain policies, but here those policies are not being enforced. So that's what we need to do over here, is we need to challenge our governments on provincial, federal, municipal levels, our police enforcement agencies, to start enforcing these policies and start to enforcing these laws. And until we do that, I mean, there's other things that can happen to put a dent in human trafficking. But I strongly believe until we start focusing on the end result, which is the end user, which is the men. It's men, and they're men who have no moral value, who have low morals, who want to rape children, are seeking out sexual services from children. That's what is happening with human trafficking. It is men raping children. That's what is happening. Men raping women. These children and these women do not want to be there. And until we start holding the men accountable, we start seeing them being arrested, seeing them being held accountable, seeing them being named and shamed, we are not going to see any difference in this province or in this country. And that ends my presentation.
Thank you very much, Sister Cheyenne. So thank you, first of all, for sticking under your time. You did very well. And I think that you made a couple of critical points, which I just want to highlight. You made a point about the young women, whether they're 25 or 12 or whatever their age is, believing somehow that they are not being trafficked, right? They are confused. Someone likens them at the mall or wherever. They see them at school. They buy them exciting things. They take them. All of a sudden, they become part of a trafficking ring, and then they themselves contribute to capital accumulation for their pimps or for this larger system. And so one of the things that I wanted to also just highlight for our viewers is that this question of sexual violence and human trafficking, specifically around women, it's a large web of capitalist accumulation. There's a lot of money in sexual violence. There's a lot of money in human trafficking. This is not just an average person on the street who's just making $3 or $4 off of, or 3 or 4 CDs off of trafficking one young lady. There are webs, right? And many people are connected from a very capitalist perspective to the trafficking of women and sexual violence. So I think that that's something that we also want to put in the back of our minds when we start talking about discussions. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. You did well. So we're gonna actually move on now to a presentation which is very exciting from Sister Zukiswa, who is a comrade in Azania, in the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. She's a queer feminist organizer committed to the cause of African people through movement building. She's invested in transformative justice and community accountability as an ethic and praxis for interrogating and addressing violence. systems of power and oppression. She works as a consultant supporting organizations with strategic communications and social justice strategy. She's a member of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania PAC. She also organizes with the Azanian Women's Collective and Shafuba Feminist Movement. She is based in Johannesburg, Azania. You will help me with the feminist movement.
Shaisfuba.
Shaisfuba. Let me just say, I have a problem with languages, so please don't be offended. What she's going to bring to us today is she's going to talk about human trafficking in Southern Africa. And the thing that I'm excited about her presentation is it's not just going to be about trafficking women across continents, but it's also going to be about trafficking in Africa and how we are either complicit or we can be part and parcel of the solution. So sister, you have the floor, 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'm apologizing in advance for reading. Sister Mjiba did say that, she's going to be monitoring our time. So, yes. Let's go. Okay, so molweni dumelang, bonjour, boa tarde, and good afternoon, beautiful, brilliant, and resilient Africans on the continent and the diaspora. It is always a welcome honor to be in community with my people, even as this important work of building and organizing is made difficult by a global pandemic which continues to threaten the lives and well-being of the most vulnerable amongst us, the African or Black, if you like, and poor. Let me take this opportunity to thank the All African People's Revolutionary Party for organizing this important convening, as well as for the invite, and the vanguard of all oppressed African people in Azania, the Pan-Africanist Congress, led by Comrade President Mzondle Nyonso and Deputy President Lunga Mantashe, and the entirety of the NEC. Global Africa is under siege. We find our people tormented by state and security machinery right in the middle of a global pandemic. White violence is relentless in its commitment to our genocide and suffering, regardless of the color of the faces who do its bidding. From Africa Collins Khoza's brutal murder at the hands of state security forces here in Azania, killed in his home in the impoverished community of Alexandria by the South African military, his only sin drinking a beer while being Black, to the murder of Brother George Floyd by the racist police machinery in occupied USA, to the abduction and sexual assault of Sister Cecilia Chimbiri and 2 other sister comrades by the police state in Zimbabwe for leading hunger protests in the country just a few weeks ago, where they were taken to a remote area, beaten, stripped naked, sexually assaulted with firearms, and even forced to drink each other's urine. Indeed, Africans everywhere must fight to overthrow imperialism, neo-colonial regimes disguised as democratic governments, and global white power. May we continue to remember all who fight on our behalf and those who have succumbed. May they struggle even as they die senseless deaths never be in vain. And may we remember to insist on this work, this labor of love for our people, so that our children and grandchildren may ultimately inherit a nation, a united socialist Africa where all her people are both freed and live free. Thank you once again. So human trafficking and sexual violence, a crisis of capitalist patriarchy in the neo-colonial makeup of post-colonial, colonial Africa. So human trafficking, as per Sister Mjiba's definition, is a very sophisticated and expensive industry. The trade in human beings for sex slavery, exploitative labor, organ harvesting, religious and other cults is far and wide. I will be focusing on the first 2 to make the point ultimately, and leading to the age-old question, and one of the reasons why we are here, what should be done? My argument is that human trafficking and sexual violence, as per the topic of the sitting, is the same sides of the exploitation coin. African women, children, and men are trafficked within our own countries to neighboring countries, sub-regionally, regionally, and to other continents for sexual exploitation, domestic slavery as soldiers, sex slaves, tourists, and so on, right? So we are exploited as slaves in Middle Eastern countries, North Africa, the UK, Italy, Spain, and many other European countries. What I want to focus on is the ways, particularly for the sitting, And I'm glad that there's going to be, a part 2, because this thing is like vast, and there's critical sort of insights that we might not be able to cover. So I want to look at, poverty, high levels of unemployment and addiction as being among some of the very real and very brutal consequences of corrupt governance and manifestation of imperialist policies presided by neo-colonial governments in our continent. For many young people and children, the combined effects of these at different levels contribute to many of our people being trapped in the vast, growing, and seemingly unending industry of trading in human lives for profit. What we must never shy away from is this. Human trafficking, like most of the worst of that which make up the social ills of our people, which make up the social ills our people are confronted with, is racialized, gendered, and classed. As Robert Sobukwe teaches us, it is meet that we speak the truth before we die. And for me, the truth can be summed up as thus. Following from Sister Cheyenne's wonderful presentation, is that when it comes to, sexual violence, sex slavery, the conditions which make this trafficking possible, sex trafficking in particular, is a world which has normalized male depravity and entitlement to the bodies of women and children. I say this because I do not want us to fall into the trap which, allows us to absolve ourselves of the ways in which we perpetuate harm, and the kind of harm which puts our communities at risk. Rape and sex slavery are, of course, the most gratuitous forms of global patriarchal violence and domination. However, it is sustained by a rape culture normalized by a patriarchy we all collaborate to sustain, albeit at varying levels. Some of us are so brazen in our defense of the system of power that we hide behind institutions like religion and culture. But we have long run out of time to negotiate our commitment to dismantling patriarchal domination. Because patriarchy kills, and this is true in this continent of ours which we love so much, which continues to grapple with the violent impositions of Arab, Islamic, and Judeo-Christian traditions, as well as colonial interpretations of that which we consider culture. But unfortunately, I only have about 10 minutes to make my submission, so at the risk of being narrow, let me get straight to the point of the sitting today, that the sex trafficking of children and young people in global Africa and the capitalist patriarchy which makes it thrive, presided once again by institutional corruption at every turn, right? We must be clear that this thriving industry, which is grossly understated and underestimated in this part of the world, is not at all possible outside of corruption and official complicity. It is simply not possible without these things, these factors, rather. So the non-investigating and non-processing of cases to pursue transnational drug and trafficking networks is a consequence of people who are able to exert power, choosing, quite frankly, not to, for politically charged and or other personal agendas. Now, it is no small coincidence that a significantly high proportion of sex trafficking victims are children, and that in comparison, young women make up a higher number of victims than young men. Sex trafficking is a direct result of men enacting their ruthless power to make real even their evil desires to rape children and exploit people for sex. The same is true for their desires to have access to and trade in sex slavery. In Southern Africa, similar to the experience in West Africa, human trafficking is quite high, even as we do not talk about it or organize around it enough, even as it is understated. Occupied Tanzania, Mozambique, and Zambia and Lesotho are what would be called source, transit, and destination countries for human trafficking in Southern Africa, and the continent at large even. What this means is that these are the countries where the demand to trade in the enslavement of human beings has a strong market. Young people and small children are sourced, transported, and sold to the highest bidder. A source country is one where traffickers recruit victims for exploitation. A transit country is an intermediary country where a victim is moved to after recruitment. These countries are, often have ineffective border control and corrupt government officials. And a destination country is one that receives the victims of such trafficking. Now, the economy of a destination country is generally prosperous, enough to support sex trafficking and human trafficking in general. While it is estimated that millions are currently enslaved, only about 50,000 to 100,000 cases are solved each year, with victims being ranging from 12 to 24 years of age. Globally, it is estimated that only 1% of cases are resolved. I'm so sorry. I'm dealing with an ailing mother. I just have to attend to this.
No problem. So we're going to go ahead and give her a second. Are you back?
Yeah, I think I'm back. Whew. Sorry, I'm back. Where was I? Yeah. So, globally, it's estimated that only 1%, like 1% of cases are resolved, even as there's 40.3 million or so victims globally. In 2017, we are sitting at 40.3 million. Some of the stats quickly: 71% of these being female, 29% being male, 24.9 million in forced labor, and 15.4 million in forced marriages, right? While Africa accounts for only 16% of the human population, 23% of the 40 million people under sex slavery. Note even that this is only recorded cases. This 40 million is only like what is recorded, right? 23% of the 40 million people are African. 9.24 million Africans are enslaved worldwide. This is a crisis with billions, and this is important. This industry ranges from between 5 billion to 40 billion annually, right? While it is local oppressed people, who do the wheeling and dealing, so the men and women in our continents and countries who do this, in many cases, some of them being those who were trafficked and thus victims themselves. Much like drugs, however, these are bottom feeders. Now, who sits at the top? Quite frankly, it's rich, elite, white, and non-black men. Even official documentation relatively concludes that our governments are simply not doing enough to address the problem of human trafficking. But even as this is the case, reports barely engage on the crisis in Libya, where Africans are being trafficked, exploited, and openly sold as slaves. And at an institutional level, one would not be faulted for concluding that our governments not seem to view trafficking as a major problem to be tackled. Not enough social and political will, coupled with required resources to aid prevention, prosecution, and protection and care of victims, as alluded by Sister Cheyenne, is done. In some of our countries, we even view the victims as criminals themselves. In occupied Tanzania, for example, our patriarchy exposes our contempt for women. It is the easier narrative to lay the blame on young women who like things obsessed with materialism, rather than zone in on the structural problems of a deeply broken and unequal society where male manipulation in the form of blesser circles, charismatic pastors, and dubious recruitment agencies thrive in this dark underworld. I also hope to demonstrate later how even our anger at an economy that excludes and even sacrifices our lives at its altar the rages are unduly directed at Africans not born in Tanzania. And this blinds us to the ways in which indentured labor and forced economic migration is the same side of the capitalist exploitation coin, right? The same side of neoliberal, neo-colonial African governments that continue to fail us with their insistence on implementing, imperialist policies. Perpetrators are hardly punished as a result of this, or are left off with the slap on the wrists. Our governments are complicit and collude with traffickers to fuel this crisis. In Tanzania, sex trafficking the sex trafficking open secret is as such. It is our men who operate whole entire syndicates, who operate these syndicates, who dominate and control the commercial sex business in the inner cities of Johannesburg and other urban centers, while local criminal rings control child prostitution in the country. While Europeans tend to operate the crime syndicates which control prostitution businesses in the Cape Town axis. Government agents, including the police and the Department of Home Affairs, look away once you pop a bribe, supply travel documents for a bribe, demand or demand forced sex on victims. Now, I make this point to say that our communities are aware to a large extent of the evil that is happening. What makes our organizing incredibly hard as we fight to disrupt, the drug transnational trade and the trafficking transnational trade is the level of corruption at those levels. I hope to speak on that a little bit, in the discussion. Let me rush through this thing. Sister Mjiba, please let me know how much time I have.
Your time is finished, but I'll give you 2 more minutes.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Sorry.
Can I have 5, please? I want to speak on the okay, cool.
No problem. 5 minutes.
Let me see what I want to jump. Okay. So I hope I've done a little justice to locate the crisis as being endemic of neoliberal Africa's problem of its government, their policies and corruption. Now, high levels of unemployment, poverty, hunger, corruption, political and economic instabilities have created a ripe market for the exploitation of our people. What we do not talk about enough is the high rates of human enslavement for domestic labor purposes in Southern Africa, right? And Tanzania in particular. If sex slavery is made possible through the sheer force of patriarchal violence affirming male depravity through a whole industry, then labor slavery is its equivalent with regards to catering to the appetite of the middle class and elite for exploitation. From the prospects of a better income or even just any job at all, capitalism's failure to sustain and dignify human life and worth continues to render all oppressed and poor people globally as fodder. Trafficking issues and challenges often revolve around 3 variables, right? The demand for cheap labor and exploitation on the one hand, and the unwillingness to meet basic economic needs for survival on the other. I'm going to jump a huge chunk of this, which is so unfortunate. And yeah, wow, I should not have read this thing. I should have just, but let me jump right into what I think then should be done, right? In terms of dealing with the silence of human trafficking. Contemporary issues around decriminalization of sex work, for example, and xenophobic violence as another example, are the sites of struggle and organizing where we must absolutely interrogate deeper and more meaningfully to ask the kinds of critical questions which will help our people make sense of the endemic situation of neocolonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy, which are the root causes of the socioeconomic crisis, which is manifested as human trafficking in this instance, right? So my argument here is that while some of us will struggle at the level of policy, if we're not asking the right questions and having a full view of the picture, we will constantly come to the wrong conclusions and we will consistently see arguments which are really not vast enough for the sake of having one thing being true at the expense of the other. Efforts to address, at the macro level, efforts to address human trafficking in Africa must move out of conference rooms in posh hotels and really focus on the direct work to end this terrible phenomenon, right? And this is part of our fight to defeat neocolonialism and imperialism, ultimately. And at the micro level, and I'm concluding here, is my argument is that we must fight and insist much more harder on building community-led responses to the socioeconomic crisis of our time. So interrogating patriarchy at the level of culture and social norms, interrogating the ways in which capitalism manifests in the most gruesome and evil ways, even at the community level. So we must build the resilience of our communities to be fiercely protective of each other. We need to rely more on community networks of care. We need to rely on strong movements who exist as vanguards of the people to mobilize us to take the people who terrorize our communities head on. It must be dangerous for criminals to build bases in our communities, to traffic people, to sell their drugs. It must be dangerous for police officers to collaborate with those who terrorize us. Organization, organization, organization. Right? Things such as post-care support and counseling for survivors as addicts becomes a practical means to disrupt the chain which makes our youth vulnerable to sex trafficking. Another example is organizing for labor laws which are vast in the ways in which they account for undocumented laborers. As a mechanism there should be a way to report exploitation without risking criminality of those who would be undocumented, right? And really in a nutshell, No, it's fine. I know I took time. I know I took time. It's fine. Let's go into the discussion. Let's go into the discussion. Thank you for your patience,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you so much. This is Zakiswa from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. And I'm sure you all will agree with me that this was a very expansive presentation, one that talked about sort of the local contradictions around human trafficking and sexual violence, the local actors, and also connected it directly to the capitalist system. And I think that it's important to remind ourselves that capitalism is it's a mode of production, right? It's characterized by private ownership. And in many cases, we think that private ownership is about stuff. In some cases, private ownership is about the ownership of women's bodies, the ownership, sexual violence, the ownership of this question of ownership in human trafficking. And it's about what relationship do we have to the means of production? Sister Zakiswa made an excellent point about poverty and how poverty makes us do things that we wouldn't ordinarily do. Like, for example, get into the sex trade, or even participate in human trafficking after we have gotten out of the sex trade. And I just want to drop a quick statistic, and then I think it's important for us to open to discussions. And then I'm hoping that Cheyenne, you can hop in here during the discussion as well, and you can bring a lot of the end of your presentation in. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we all know the Congo. We all know the coltan that powers our laptops, that powers our cell phones, that powers our iPads. And we also know that 1 in 4 women in the Congo will be raped in her lifetime. We know that UN workers in the Congo, there's a report out that UN workers were indiscriminately raping women in the Congo during the Civil War. So when we're, and I'm sorry to say this, but some of those UN workers were of African descent, right? So it's not just about whether someone is African or not African. It's about their ideology and their allegiance to capitalism or their allegiance to Pan-Africanism, right? They're either the people's class or the anti-people's class. And lastly, I just want to say that this question of patriarchy and how patriarchy is directly impacts women on a daily basis, from whether we'll give birth, when we'll give birth, to our roles in society, to our access to education, to the ability for people to be persecuted or not persecuted for sexual violence, to human trafficking. It's a system which is connected to the capitalist exploitation, the capitalist system. We must not divorce that, right? We have to talk about this as our previous speaker said, from a very macro perspective, as well as a micro perspective. What can we do every day to address sexual violence and human trafficking? But there's been sexual violence and human trafficking for many years. So that means that it's also connected institutionally to patriarchy and capitalism. And so we have to begin to have those hard conversations as well about the larger piece. So what I want to do is I want to say, we have people watching on Facebook, and we also have people here on Zoom. For the people on Zoom, we want this to be an interactive discussion. And so we're going to open it up directly to questions. I'm going to pose 2 questions to the presenters that they can be thinking about. And then we're going to promote everyone on Zoom to panelists. So if you don't want your picture to be shown, to turn off your video. But that way, if you want to speak, you can let us know in the chat that you want to speak, or you can raise your hand in person and then raise your question. So we're going to give Brother Jossie, who's managing the backroom stuff, about 2 minutes to promote everyone to panelists. Please take your video off if you don't want us to be seen. Perhaps you've not prepared to be seen on Zoom, which is fine. So just take your video off. And if you're ready to speak, you can speak using audio, you can speak using video. In the meantime, I want to us to virtually congratulate our speakers and give them a clap, because this was a very interesting and exciting discussion. So I have 2 questions that I want the panelists to be thinking about. The first question, which that Sister Zakiswa really touched on a bit, as well as Sister Cheyenne, is what are some of the current strategies being employed to combat and eradicate sexual violence in Canada and human trafficking in Azania? And are these strategies effective, right? And then the second question is, how can Pan-Africanists and or progressive African people address social violence, and human trafficking locally, nationally, and globally. So what can we do on an everyday basis? Do we have to go to the police? Do we have to wait on the politicians? How can we also address this culture of sexual violence and human trafficking in the larger African community? So I'm gonna now open the floor to any panelists, any attendees who wanna raise a question. And we have, okay, so the floor is open. Is anyone interested in raising a question? You can just unmic yourself and then ask. And while we're waiting, we have a question that came out of Facebook. Let me just get it. The question is, are governments being paid to do nothing? So are governments being paid to do nothing? So why don't we do this to let our new panelists, presenters get themselves together? Why don't we ask you all to answer the two questions I raised, and then this question about our governments, what are our governments being paid to do? Sister Cheyenne, do you want to take the lead? And you have about 5 minutes to sort of respond, because we want to do a back and forth. Sorry about that, technical difficulties, we're back. Sister Cheyenne, do you want to take that question? I think you're muted still.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back, welcome.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so those are really good questions. So here in Canada, what is happening is there's two things, I guess I'll say. The first thing is back in 2014, the government passed a bill, Bill C-36. And what that bill did is it decriminalized the selling of sex and instead criminalized the buying of sex. So people who are prostituting themselves, or choosing to prostitute themselves, and people who are being trafficked can no longer be charged or arrested. And the traffickers and the Johns, who are people who buy sex, can be charged and arrested. So that's a great thing. This is something that we wanted. This is something that's in place. We want this to continue. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, Canada is really good at putting policies on paper, but really bad at enforcing them. So is this strategy effective? It's not, because it's not being enforced. There are some provinces like London, Ontario, that are doing a really good job at enforcing this and arresting Johns, arresting traffickers, and they're having some great results. There's also a women's organization up there that puts a lot of pressure on the police departments and the government, so they're doing a great job there. However, here in Nova Scotia, this is one of my greatest battles and greatest fights, is because our local police department absolutely refuses to put any pressure on the Johns or put any pressure on the buyers. They refuse to enforce the law. This is the law, but they refuse to enforce it. And when I spoke with the chief of police last year, I was told that the reason that they don't enforce the law is because they would rather put their time and attention on dealing with the girls, on dealing with the survivors and the victims. Now, some people may say, okay, well, that's fine. What's wrong with that? They're trying to help the girls. But what I say to that is BS, because really it comes down to them just trying to make relationships with the girls, so the girls will tell them the information they need to, so they can continue to put the pimps in jail, the traffickers in jail, because that's a much easier fight. And for other reasons, it's just that just seems to be their focus. But again, it would be more effective if they would just enforce the law and go after the demand, going after the Johns. So I don't think that is effective. The other thing that's happening here in Canada is last year, there's a national strategy to combat human trafficking where the government announced they will be putting $57+ million to combat human trafficking within 5 years, and then another $10 million annually. Again, that sounds great on paper. That's really good. But when you look closer into what exactly is being proposed, the money is going to help. This is the same thing. All the attention is going on services, which we do need. Don't get me wrong. I'm an advocate. I support services. We need all kinds of things, post-care support. We need housing. There's lots of things that we need. However, when you look closely at what the government's proposing, nothing is going to end the demand. So once again, it's like, okay, look what we're doing. We're putting all this money forward, but really don't tell me that you want to end human trafficking if you're not putting anything on increasing vice units or increasing police officers to be on the street. And if you're not trying to hold John stings, which is arresting these guys who are trying to rape these children. So to me, I don't think they're effective at all. And I think it's just something that they can say that they're doing, but it really doesn't hold any value to me at all.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Sister Zukiswa, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay. So, in Azania, we don't have a shortage of laws that make us look good on paper, right, across the board. We simply have a crisis of making those laws meaningful to ordinary people, because we have like a crisis of implementation of really good laws and policies. So, we are very compliant from about 2004 with, we ratified protocols of the UN. And during former President Jacob Zuma's presidency, he signed the first comprehensive, this was in 2013, the first comprehensive piece of legislation to get as close as possible to tackling the problem, known as the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking Persons Bill, right? Which really was made to, meet the international demands of international bodies, right? And the act criminalizes various acts that constitute as trafficking, even though it can be a little bit blurry as like what that is in terms of the actual experiences of trafficking. Like it's not only this gratuitous, as Cheyenne was explaining, experience, right? And also provide certain protections for victims, including so-called foreign nationals who are really our siblings. So the effectiveness, I go back to the point, right? It's good to have policy frameworks which lay the foundation, right? But when you are dealing with a situation where we have not been able to disrupt the demand for human trafficking, it's another story. I really want to leave comrades with this specific point that South Africa is very complicit in the trafficking of of our people, and I want to also locate so that in terms of disrupting the demand, right? We must burden the middle class and elite of the country, for instance, with the ways in which they take advantage of the situation of the exploitation of our people, right? We were speaking yesterday, Sister Mjiba and Cheyenne, where there are houses which hoard Basotho people, Zimbabwean people, Mozambican people, and middle class people basically go and pick and choose who we want at a fraction of really it's slavery. And so we need to be really honest about that and really be able to think and strategize what it would mean to sort of have a punitive element to people who engage in human trafficking on that level. There are people who are working on people's farms and people's families raising their children who are indentured. So I gave your family 20,000 rand and you from 18 are going to work for me until 30. Like this is happening, right? And we're not talking about it enough and naming it as trafficking. Then there is disrupting the demand, as Sister Cheyenne mentioned, at the level of this demand for sex slavery. And part of why our work is delayed, comrades, is that we do not, I don't know if there's not enough, I'm still insisting on my argument that there's not enough organization at the community level, because that is where strategies would be effective. So we know that there's buildings in Hillbrow, for example, where they house sex slaves, where and they drug them and force them to a life of addiction to be able to run their syndicates. The police know, the military knows, people at the borders knows, community members know. And so we know that we're not going to be able to necessarily win that fight at that level. So what is it that we can do? It is to begin to get back into that spirit where we protect our communities, right? We must literally be the vanguard of our communities. It must be known that the people of Dobsonville or the people of Hillbrow or whatever, supported by mass movements, right, are engaged in the everyday struggle of ensuring that our girls, our children, are cared for and protected for. It is too easy nowadays for criminal activities to happen, and then what happens before I conclude is that we then misname the problem. So we'll have a sporadic xenophobic protests, for example, but we have not done the work of really interrogating, are these people even here by will, right? What is the conditions that have led them to be there? And on that note, what makes human trafficking thrive and make our brothers and sisters victim is the failure, once again, of our neo-colonial governments to build strong, efficient African states. And so we are constantly, as a people, assaulted by socioeconomic problems, which we then mistake for the bigger problem, and it manifests in these ways. Another example that I gave also earlier was even at the level of, as feminists on the continent, organizing around decriminalization, which must happen. We must be thorough in how we conceive of this, so that we can be able to account for the ways in which some people will fall into, the cracks. So in a nutshell, there's laws. There's no shortage of laws in countries necessarily. There's a shortage of the implementation of laws because of corrupt officials. And so where we can make our strongest interventions as community organizers is consistently being the watchdogs in our communities, consistently ensuring that we are committed to the protection of our people, and really rooting out the forces as best as possible, which make the ways in which we exploit each other possible.
Thank you so much, sister. And I think that you all have really brought this together in a nutshell. We have about 3 questions and we want to raise them. And then unfortunately, I'm so disappointed, but we have to close this. But as we mentioned, we're going to have a part 2. So the first question, I think, and comrade, I have a problem with names. Tandi Oletu, please, you're welcome. Can you take off your mic and your mute and your video and let us know? Aha, comrade, how are you? Welcome, long time. Oh. You're muted. Okay, you're welcome. Comrade, long time. Oh.
Greetings, comrade Njimai and the panelists. You are very naturally.
Isolate.
I sister here. Just a few points that I'm going to make to comrade Iswa first. There is an article that has been written, I think it was in 2019, where let me just quickly make a direct link to that article, where Sister Nozizwe Malala, she said that.
Comrade, you're breaking up a bit. Can you reposition?
Yeah, I'm also struggling to hear.
Can we hear you?
Is it better now?
Yes, try now.
Okay. She argues that we seek to abolish the system of prostitution, which supplies the demand for sex trafficking. International and our own research shows there is a definite link between prostitution and sex trafficking. This was said by Sister Nozizwe Malala, who is the director of Embrace Dignity.
I can't hear. Can you type it in? Can you type the question?
Yeah, can you type it in, because we can't hear and it's very grr. So if you can type it in, we can quickly resolve that. Is that fine?
I'll write to him now that he must please type.
Excellent, excellent. I think he's even dropped off. Oh, he's in. He's still in. I think he's trying to organize himself. Okay, so we're gonna quickly move on to our next question, and I think we have one from Kenya Williams. Often sexual violence. If Kenya wants to jump in on the conversation, Kiana, I'm sorry, she's willing to get in. Kiana, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to ask it? Kiana, you're welcome. Hi, you're welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this discussion today. It's been really insightful and extremely informative. The question I have is surrounding, often when we have these discussions, it tends to be women speaking to women, and the end user and the perpetrator often tends to be men. So how do we involve men actively in these discussions so that they can in a way that we are not appeasing them or justifying their actions, but ensuring that they too understand their responsibility and they need to be accountable and involved in these discussions as well?
I think that's an excellent question. So panelists, if you can hold that question, and we're going to try to get our last question, see if our comrade can type it in, and then if he's still on the line, and then we can get that and take any last minute questions and do a quick close. Comrade, do you want to bring your question back in? Okay, so we'll give him an opportunity to type. And why don't we? The one question I would like us to answer while we end up, because we're closing in about 5 minutes, is as Pan-Africanists, what do we do in our own organizations and in our own movement spaces to address sexual violence? And I'm glad that the sister Kiana asked the question about men and how do we involve men in the conversation. So I think that my question would be, how do we raise these critical questions both inside movement spaces and also in our own lives, and what contributions can we make to creating lasting solutions that address human trafficking and sexual violence from a revolutionary Pan-Africanist perspective? So Sister Cheyenne, do you want to take the floor for about 2 minutes? Sorry about that. Maybe sure, 2.5. Okay.
Sure, it's no problem at all. I can work within 2 minutes. First and foremost, thank you for the question. That's a really good question. So how I would answer that is, I truthfully do not think it's women's responsibility to try to get men involved in this conversation. I think men need to step up to the mic and do it themselves. I think that's one of our issues, is that we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we get men involved? How can we pull them in? But this is their issue. It is affecting us horribly, but this is their issue. And I think that there are men advocates out there, but I think that this is where we have to push for the law. We have to push for the law to do their jobs that they take an oath to do. And we have to push for our governments to enforce these laws and to get the word out. But as women, I do not think it is our role to go out and try to convince a man to come and engage in this conversation. I think we need to continue to do what we're doing today, which is continue to have the conversation. If men want to join into that, that's great. The second part of the question, what was the second part of the question? Or was it the, how do we engage?
How do we engage both internally to organization, in different Pan-African spaces, in movement type, and even in our everyday lives, as we walk away from this program, it would be nice for us to all do one thing, in our spaces that can really address sexual violence and human trafficking. So what would your recommendation be?
That's a really good question too. And you know what, it's a question that I kind of dread to get sometimes based on where I'm living, because I would love to be able to say that we can join certain organizations to help get the word out. But unfortunately, where I live, there just are not any organizations that are reputable, that are in a position that I believe to deal with the complex trauma of people involved in this situation. But on a practical level, like on the terms of one person going out saying, okay, what can I do? Well, first and foremost, I would say this: as women, we can respect each other, and you can start to understand your value, who you are as a woman. First and foremost, you have to realize who you are as a woman. And men and women, I think it also helps if we can start raising our boys to respect their sisters. We can start raising boys to respect women. I think that's something that everybody can do. And most importantly, I think that we can educate ourselves. That's something everybody can do right now. Thankfully, to the World Wide Web, it doesn't take a lot of effort to educate yourself on this important issue. You can, before this issue, you could have said, I didn't realize this was happening. I didn't realize it was happening on this scale. But now that you know. So I always say to people, okay, so now that you know, what are you going to do about it? It's not my job to try to point you in the right direction. It's no one else's job. It comes internally. What are you going to do about it? You make that choice and you go out and step out and do something.
Okay, thank you so much. Those are some excellent recommendations. Thank you very much. So Sister Zakizwa, I think, have you seen the question in the chat from African brother? Can you read the question out to everyone, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to, can I please start with the first question?
Yes, please.
I'll do 1 minute, 1 minute. 1 minute, 1 minute.
However you want to manage it, just as long as we get the brother's question inside.
Sure thing. So, thank you to the sister for raising that. And my insistence, even in my own space of organizing, is that men who, have an allegiance to revolutionary politics can no longer continue to undermine patriarchy as a fight that is concerning all of us, right? And so where people have the power to change or influence social and behavioral norms at the micro institution should do so, right? And the business of men becomes engaging this work at the level of culture and custom, as well as the level of religious institutions, right? And the ways in which they create the conditions that are rife for this kind of thing to go undetected and unnoted. I emphasized in my presentation earlier that it's far easier for us to separate ourselves from the problem when we consistently imagine sexual violence and human trafficking in the most sort of gratuitous forms, because then we get to sit in our corners and say, well, I don't engage in the selling of human beings, or I don't engage in rape and beating my partner, therefore I am a good man. There are no good men in conditions of bondage and violence. And our men need to be far less personal and sensitive and far more committed to undermining a society which, oppresses women and children, and that oppression is exactly what sustains the possibility of the most extreme cases where there is a market and demand for the trafficking of sex slaves who are children and young people, where there's a market where
Sister, are you there? I think that she's frozen. Can you all hear me still? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
movement is to take.
She's
Yes.
back. Welcome back.
Yes. The work of. Oh, sorry. Okay. The work of men is to interrogate patriarchy at the level of culture and religion, and really come to the party to undermine a world where this is possible, right? And of course, really the fighting and joining our fights as we organize towards undermining, the ways in which it plays out, even in its most gratuitous forms. Now, to Tando's question really quickly, who says, we seek to abolish the system of prostitution which supplies the demand for sex trafficking. International and our own research shows a definite link between prostitution and sex trafficking. This is from an article by Nosizwe Madlala, who's arguing, So Tando's question is as such: how do we respond to this assertion, since there is a call for decriminalization of sex work? Right. So once again, as I said earlier, our obsession with wanting to be right or wrong, or to winning both sides of the argument happens at the expense of our people, because we're not willing to be far-reaching and expansive enough in how we imagine solution making, right? So I can easily come with research that proves that can show that criminalization actually, contributes to lessening the existence of human trafficking. Someone else can come with research that shows that decriminalization actually puts women more at risk. But if we are honest with ourselves, is that there's simply not enough data. And if we're also honest with ourselves, we know that, and if you organize in community with sex workers, you will know that part of the stigma and the sex work being criminalized creates the exact kind of conditions which make this dark underworld thrive, right? It's the same with drugs and addiction. It's the same, and it's the same with sex work. People, when you create a condition where people cannot report violation, where people who wish to escape cannot access support and care, you are literally more likely to be contributing to the problem. I argue that what we need to include in the conversation around decriminalization is rather, in what ways can we demand and imagine stronger anti-trafficking laws and their implementation such that they support the decriminalization going in the way that it should, as opposed to the other side of the extreme. Because we know enough about sex work, because we organize in the space to know that criminalization harms, and we also know enough about being in community with domestic workers who are victims of trafficking, being in community with formerly sex trafficked victims, that it's not a crisis of awareness in our communities, more than it's a crisis of implementation at the level of law enforcement officials, as well as the crisis of a lack of community resilience, which is able to serve as a front to root out where we know exists these kinds of practices, and to root out the police and the officials who at the level of our community and community policing profit on this serious crisis of our times. I hope I have managed to clump those two things in. But I also must emphasize really quickly that this work is about men as well. I even argue that even the labor movements, for example, should be invested in the work of human trafficking, particularly for the ways in which this happens because of the demand for exploiting labor, right? Similarly, our movements for revolutionary movements must be engaged in these questions around decriminalization, sex trafficking, and male dominance. And
I think we lost her again. I hope she'll come back. Okay, so we're gonna wait for her to come back, and hopefully she'll finish her statement. But I think that on this point, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So let's see. Will she come back? She's now on mute. So with this last very powerful statement, I want to just reemphasize that this is a series of conversations that we're going to be having. This is the beginning of the conversations, but Sister Zukiswa said something that was extremely important. She said that both men and women have a role and responsibility to addressing sexual violence and human trafficking. She said that this is a larger issue, right? Sister Cheyenne also connected this to a larger issue of capitalism. And so the question becomes, how do we also create both micro and macro solutions? And I want to, on behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, thank you all for being on this podcast or this Zoom meeting. I also want to announce that we'll have our part 2, June 30th, which is in about 3 weeks, and we'll have 2 additional panelists who will take this conversation to the next level. We got one last question from Brother Tando, and his question, which we can't answer, is how does scientific socialism assist in solving this problem, since it's clear that human trafficking and sex slavery is entangled with capitalism? So if we can I close anything out today, the most important thing that we would say as an APRP is that we must join organizations. Join an organization fighting for the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people, including women. Be in a work study process where you're reading and studying about the social construction of gender and how we must tear down capitalism and patriarchy in order for our children and our children's children to have a better world. On behalf of the APRP, AWRU, and PAC, and our panelists, I say forward ever, backwards never. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you all. And this will be streamed live on Facebook.